It was the kind of Oxford evening that seemed to fold the world in on itself, the buildings leaning inward like old confidants sharing a secret. I remember walking past the Radcliffe camera with a faint ache in my knee that always arrived before the rain. The stone glowed with that soft, reluctant light peculiar to early dusk, and the air carried the smell of wet leaves ground into the pavement. I had no business wandering there, no case on my mind, only the small, persistent longing for something unnamed that often guided my feet. A pair of students passed behind me, their voices drifting ahead in uncertain fragments. One of them said she didn't come in today, not even to open the vault. The other murmured something that sounded like worry disguised as boredom. I might have ignored it entirely if not for the slight hesitation, a moment when their steps faltered and the tension between them thickened. It was the pause that stayed with me, not the words. I kept walking, though the remark unsettled the quiet I'd been carrying. The Radcliffe stones seemed to listen more sharply, as if they too had heard something that shouldn't have been uttered aloud. I told myself it was nothing, some trivial academic hiccup, the kind Oxford produces in droves. But I've learned that a whisper born on cold air often contains the seed of a darker truth. Rain began tapping lightly at the iron railings, a sound soft enough to feel almost intentional. I stopped under the colonnade, drawing a slow breath while the evening pressed closer. My mind, which was never good at letting matters rest, kept circling back to the vault. A librarian not turning up for her morning shift shouldn't have mattered to me. Yet I felt the faint prick of curiosity, the kind that arrives before reason has a chance to intervene. Lewis called me then, interrupting the moment with his usual quiet steadiness. There had been a report filed, he said. Something vague but troubling. A staff member in the Bodleian had been expected hours earlier and had left no message, no sign of delay. I listened with that familiar mixture of impatience and interest, knowing I would go regardless of how unimportant it sounded. I told him I'd look in after a walk, though I suspect he already knew I was halfway there. When I reached the library entrance, the lamps had been lit, casting warm circles on the slick flagstones. A porter nodded at me with that subdued recognition peculiar to men who have seen too much of both scholars and policemen. He mentioned, almost reluctantly, that the missing woman had been last seen heading toward the vault. There was something in his voice, an undertone of unease that hinted at more than simple absence. Oxford has a way of teaching its inhabitants to fear the wrong things. Inside, the corridors felt unusually hollow, every footstep stretching farther than expected. The air held the scent of paper and damp wool, a combination I've always associated with both comfort and foreboding. I walked toward the staircase leading below, letting the quiet sink into me. Sometimes silence reveals more than conversation ever could. A small deduction formed then, no more than a flicker of the student's hesitation, the porter's strained politeness, the closed vault door that looked too deliberately shut. There was a whisper beneath the stone, something fragile pressed into the cracks of the evening. I couldn't name it yet, but I felt its presence like a thin draft on the back of my neck. By the time I descended toward the vault, the rain outside had gathered strength, and the world above seemed to wash itself clean. But underground, in the place where books outlived their readers, the air grew heavier. I've always believed that Oxford keeps its secrets in layers, and that the deepest ones settle where sunlight cannot intrude. I paused before the vault door, listening. There was no sound, no movement, only the faint hum of the building's old bones. Yet I knew with that peculiar certainty that sometimes grips a detective without explanation that something had begun. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a soft disturbance in the quiet, a whisper carried through the stone. And I, lacking the discipline to turn away, stepped forward to hear it more clearly. Lewis met me outside the Bodleian the next morning, though the hour was still early enough that the streets felt half-formed, as though Oxford itself hadn't quite woken. He carried that expression he wears when he knows he's bringing me something unpleasant, but isn't sure how much I want to hear. The rain had softened overnight, leaving a thin sheen on every surface, and the stones looked as though they were remembering secrets rather than revealing them. Lewis told me they had found the missing librarian's spare vault key in her pigeonhole, and the way he said it suggested he was waiting for my reaction. I didn't give him one. Not at first. The key lay on a small white cloth the porter had provided, as if we were all pretending it might be contaminated with something more dangerous than ordinary silence. What unsettled me wasn't the metal itself. It was unremarkable, worn smooth by the habits of a careful hand, but the impossibility of it. She had been last seen walking toward the vault. She should have had it with her. It shouldn't have been sitting there, untouched, waiting for someone to notice its loneliness. When I stepped inside the library, the scent of old paper and damp coats clung to the air like a persistent memory. The corridor seemed narrower that morning, the walls closing just slightly as though urging me forward. The porter, a man with a face lined by decades of watching scholars grow old before their time, mentioned that no one had checked the vault logs until Lewis asked. He added, with the kind of quiet defensiveness that always signals guilt of some kind, that the logs had looked wrong even before dawn. I watched him rub his thumb across his palm as though trying to erase something invisible. The logbook itself was far too neat to be trustworthy. Every entry written with deliberate clarity, every timestamp recorded with that peculiar precision found only in libraries and laboratories. But there, it was a thin, unmistakable gap between entries, a space that had no business being empty. Someone had either left without signing out, or someone had made certain their presence vanished before the rest of us woke to the day. I traced the line with my finger, aware of Lewis watching me with that patient expectancy he never voiced, but always felt. I asked him whether her bag had been found. He said no. Whether anyone had called her flat? He said yes, but with no reply. Whether anyone had tried to contact the historian she'd been working with. At that, he hesitated. A pause stretched between us, slender but unmistakable. That's when a small deduction settled in my mind, not yet shaped enough to trust, but sharp enough to notice people hesitate not when they don't know, but when they know too much. We walked down to the vault entrance, though neither of us said much. Silence, when shared, becomes a kind of language, and the Bodleian has always been fluent in it. The metal door loomed ahead, its surface reflecting nothing of the world around it. I found myself listening for sounds that didn't exist, the whisper of pages shifting, the faint click of a latch. Just the hum of old machinery and the soft echo of our footsteps. Lewis told me the vault had remained locked all night. I nodded, though the claim felt thin, like a story told twice. I asked the archivist to join us. He arrived with an air of calm that didn't quite match the tension in his eyes. He said the missing librarian was meticulous, friendly, sometimes too earnest in her work. He said she had been researching a medieval diary with marginalia no one else could decipher. He said she had seemed distracted last week. Each sentence sounded polished for public consumption, as though he'd practiced them long before we arrived. While he spoke, he tugged slightly at the sleeve of his sweater. A gesture too small to mean anything, yet it lingered with me longer than the words themselves. Inside the vault, the lights flickered with that familiar reluctance of underground spaces. The air felt colder than expected. I noticed at once that one of the shelves near the back had a thin layer of dust, disturbed not by casual browsing, but by someone pressed close, perhaps leaning, perhaps hiding something. I didn't mention it. Sometimes silence is more instructive than accusation. I simply walked past, letting the archivist and Lewis think I'd seen nothing. What stayed with me most was the key. The way it waited in that pigeonhole with such earnest stillness, as though trying to announce something without breaking the rules of the building that held it. A key is meant to open something, but this one found. where it shouldn't be, seemed instead to close a door we hadn't yet discovered. As we stepped back into the corridor, a faint tremor of understanding passed through me early, imperfect recognition that whatever had begun here was not a matter of absence, but of arrangement. Someone had taken great care to place that key exactly where it would be found. And in Oxford, care is never innocent. I've often thought that there is nothing so revealing as a misplaced word. Not an outright lie, not even a contradiction, but a tiny disturbance in the rhythm of language. That morning, as I walked through the upper reading rooms with their echoes of quiet ambition, I felt the weight of such a disturbance long before I understood its meaning. The Bodleian had its usual scent dust warmed by lamps, wool coats carrying the faint damp of early rain, a whisper of old parchment that felt almost human in its persistence. Everything looked as it always did, except the people seemed to hold themselves a fraction too carefully, as though fear had taken up residence beside them. Lewis followed me with that subdued tread of his, asking gently whether I had slept. I told him sleep arrived as it wished, like a reluctant visitor who never felt entirely welcome. He hesitated before handing me the note discovered in the missing librarian's desk. A single line of Latin written in a tidy, almost schoolgirl hand. It meant, roughly, "Let the truth be a lamp for the worthy." The phrase tugged at something distantly familiar, but not familiar enough. That unease nudged me toward a thought I'd been avoiding. She had been trying to say something, quietly, at the edges of her own peril. The archivist appeared then, offering a strained smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He said he had forgotten to mention the note yesterday, that it had slipped his mind in the confusion. The words came a little too quickly. I have learned that when a man rushes to assure you of his honesty, what he fears most is his own transparency. I let him talk while I looked at his hands. The nails were clean, trimmed, but the skin bore faint grey smudges, the kind left by handling old manuscripts or charcoal rubbings. He claimed he had spent the morning sorting maps in the East Wing, yet the maps there were printed, not inked or etched. A small deduction, barely formed. He had been somewhere else, doing something else, and he hoped the silence between us might swallow that truth whole. We moved toward the librarian's office, the corridor unusually empty. Floorboards creaked beneath us, each sound elongated by the hush of the building. I felt the familiar tug of annoyance, not at Lewis, nor at the archivist, but at the simple fact that the missing woman was now becoming a collection of impressions filtered through others. No one spoke of her directly. Instead, they said she seemed distracted lately, or she worked too hard, or she was kinder than most. Kindness, Oxford often forgets, is not a shield. Her office smelled faintly of lavender soap and old ink. The desk drawers had been opened, but not rifled. Someone had searched gently, with a respect bordering on fear. I noticed a book lying open on the table, an edition of medieval marginalia studies, its spine cracked from use. A page corner was folded down. The footnote at the bottom mentioned the same Latin phrase as her note, but with a key difference. In the original, the line read, "Let the truth be a lamp for the seeking," not worthy. Worthiness implies judgment, seeking implies struggle. The distinction was small, but deliberate. Someone had misquoted the line, and the librarian had been careful enough to notice. It struck me then that the misquotation was not hers. The handwriting, though neat, lacked her small stylistic flourishes visible elsewhere in her notes. Someone else had left it, perhaps as a warning, perhaps as misdirection, perhaps simply because they thought no one would care enough to examine it closely. I cared, though for reasons I could not yet articulate. As Lewis waited, his patience unwavering, I felt the first outline of a problem far larger than a missing librarian. A misquoted line is like an ill-fitting stone in an ancient wall. It draws the eye, it invites pressure, and if pressed just right, it reveals the hollow space behind it. I folded the note carefully, aware that whatever truth she had glimpsed would not be found in dramatic revelations, but in these small, almost invisible disturbances. The kind Oxford cultivates with uncanny skill. I have never trusted photographs. They capture too much and too little at the same time, preserving the angle of a smile, but never the intention behind it, freezing a gesture while letting the truth slip quietly out of frame. That morning, when Lewis placed the photograph on the desk, with the same careful reluctance one uses when handing over a fragile relic, I felt an old irritation rise in me. Not at him, but at the world's misguided faith in images. Still, even I couldn't ignore what stared back from the paper, an incongruity so subtle it felt like an unearthed whisper. It was an old college group shot, taken years before the missing librarian had ever joined the Bodleian staff. The photograph showed a cluster of scholars gathered outside one of the older quads, their faces holding that particular Oxford blend of pride and weariness. But it was the figure at the edge of the composition that drew me in. He stood half in shadow, his posture slightly turned away, as though already planning his escape from the moment. I recognized him immediately. The historian, the one who had claimed, with that polished restraint of his, that he barely knew her. I asked Lewis where the photograph had been found. He explained it had been folded neatly in the bottom drawer of the librarian's desk, beneath a stack of outdated accession forms. A place where documents only go if they matter too much to discard, but are too dangerous to leave in plain sight. It troubled me that she had kept it hidden, and it troubled me more that the historian appeared younger, almost earnest in portraits I had never seen him wear in the years I'd observed him from a distance. When I visited him later that afternoon, he greeted me with that cultivated air of academic exhaustion. He spoke about deadlines, lectures, the weight of administrative burdens. His words drifted around me like well-practiced smoke. But when I mentioned the photograph, the shift was unmistakable. His gaze sharpened just briefly, and he asked where I had found it with a little too much carelessness. People often give themselves away not by the questions they ask, but by how smoothly they try to ask them. He insisted he had not been in the librarian's office recently. He insisted he had barely interacted with her beyond polite professional exchanges. He insisted far too much. And all the while, he kept his hands still, perfectly still, as though afraid they might betray some unspoken truth if allowed to move freely. A man trying to control his hands is rarely in control of his situation. As he talked, I noticed a small detailist desk held a book turned face down, its spine fragile from frequent reading. The title carried the faint trace of a language I once struggled through in college, and something about the choice of text struck me as unexpectedly sentimental. It wasn't the sort of book a man drowning in administrative tasks would keep within reach. It was the sort kept for memory, or guilt, or both. Leaving his office, I walked through the dim corridor lined with portraits of scholars long dead. Their eyes seemed to follow me with that familiar Oxford blend of knowing and indifference. The floorboards creaked beneath my steps, and the faint scent of polish mingled with the dampness drifting in from an open window. There was something about the historian's reaction that refused to settle in my mind, like a poorly aligned puzzle piece. I suspected the librarian had known something about his past, something buried in the folds of that old photograph. Lewis joined me near the stairwell, asking whether I believed the historian was lying. I told him I believed the historian was speaking carefully, which is often worse. Lies require invention. Caution requires motive. Lewis muttered that she must have kept the photograph for a reason. I didn't respond immediately. A deduction, small but persistent, had begun forming. She hadn't kept it for the faces. She'd kept it for the absence of one. In the far corner of the photograph, a gap in the group space where someone should have stood caught my eye. The kind of omission that seems accidental until examined closely. A missing presence, carefully edited by angle or choice or fear. And I wondered, not for the first time that week, whether the truth we were seeking lay not in what was visible, but in what had been deliberately removed. Photographs may not lie, but they certainly conspire. And this one, I felt, had chosen its conspirators with unsettling precision. There is a particular disappointment that comes from watching a theory collapse under its own elegance. It is not the childish sting of being wrong, nor the professional embarrassment of miscalculation, but something far quieter and inward settling, like dust disturbed by the closing of an old book. That morning, as Lewis and I descended once more towards the vault, I felt that familiar heaviness gathering. I had fashioned a theory the night before, convincing enough to carry its own shadow, and now it was beginning to crumble in the thin light of reason. The steps were slick from a lingering dampness that never seemed to leave the lower levels of the Bodleian. Each footfall echoed with a faint hollowness, as though the building itself was withholding judgment. I told Lewis that the historian had likely confronted the librarian after she discovered the forged diary entry. I described, with a precision I had foolishly trusted, how she might have attempted to expose him, how an argument could have spilled into the vault corridor, how a moment of panic might have led to violence. It all sounded perfectly plausible. Perhaps too plausible. Lewis listened with that polite restraint of his, nodding at appropriate intervals, letting me unspool my explanation. When I finished, he asked, almost apologetically, whether I had considered the simple fact that the historian had been lecturing at the exact hour she supposedly confronted the librarian. The register confirmed it. Several students vouched for it. Even the archivist corroborated it. A single contradiction, delivered gently, and the entire structure collapsed. We reached the vault door, and I found myself staring at it with an irritation that had nothing to do with Lewis. I had been seduced by the beauty of the theory, the way it shaped itself neatly around my preconceptions. Beauty, I reminded myself bitterly, is rarely the truth's accomplice. I pushed open the door, letting the cool air wash over the last remnants of my confidence. Inside, the dim lights flickered with an almost theatrical reluctance, as though mocking my earlier certainty. I walked slowly along the aisles, letting my fingertips hover over the spines of books that had survived centuries of human error. The false theory lingered like a stale taste, refusing to dissipate. I began to reassess, quietly and methodically, each assumption I had layered together. Lewis pointed out a door near the back wall, a narrow, inconspicuous panel I had noticed before but dismissed as storage. He said the archivist had mentioned nothing about it. I told him doors in old buildings rarely announce their purpose, and even more rarely reveal their secrets willingly. I reached for the handle, expecting resistance, perhaps even a locked mechanism. Instead, it opened easily, too easily, revealing nothing more than a broom, a folded step-ladder, and a faint smell of disinfectant. A false door leading nowhere. A perfect metaphor for my earlier certainty. I felt the faint tug of a deduction, then not a revelation, but a whisper. The ease of the door, the emptiness behind it, the archivist's reluctance to draw attention to it earlier. Not guilt, perhaps, but fear. Not fear of discovery, but fear of misunderstanding. A fear I knew all too well. Lewis asked what I thought. I told him that sometimes a theory fails not because it is untrue, but because it arrives too early, before the story has revealed the shape of its own shadows. He frowned at that, and I didn't blame him. I often forget that clarity, when spoken aloud, sounds suspiciously like obscurity. As we stepped back into the corridor, I felt the ache of the case settling deeper into me. The misquoted Latin line, the photograph with its missing presence, the key that insisted on being found where it shouldn't have been, all fragments that refused to bind themselves into a coherent whole. Oxford was humming with unanswered questions, and I was no closer to hearing their melody. Still, as we climbed the stairs toward the thinning daylight, I knew one thing with uncomfortable certainty. A false theory is never wasted. It reveals the edges of the truth by showing where the mind wishes to wander. And sometimes, the first door one opens, no matter how confidently, is the one that leads nowhere at all. There are moments in an investigation when the past leans forward as if eager to whisper its unfinished lines into one's ear. That afternoon, standing once more in the dim corridor outside the vault, I felt that peculiar nearness, the sense that something unseen hovered just beyond comprehension. The building was unusually still, even for the Bodleian, and the silence pressed against me with a weight that felt almost sentient. Lewis commented that the air seemed heavier than usual, but I suspected it was merely our growing awareness of how little we understood. The archivist met us beside the ledger table, carrying himself with the brittle professionalism of a man who fears the truth might fracture him if it arrives too suddenly. He said he had examined the vault log again, that nothing appeared amiss beyond the gap we already knew of. His tone was steady, but not steady enough. People who are certain speak plainly. People who are worried choose careful syllables, as though hoping language itself might act as a shield. I told him to set the log upon the table and leave us for a few minutes. He hesitated too long for innocence, and then obliged. The logbook was open to the page we had studied earlier. Neat entries, clear signatures, precise times. And yet, as I let my gaze rest on the paper, something small disturbed the symmetry. A faint smudge beside an erased line. Not an accidental brush of a hand, nor the drag of a careless finger, but the delicate residue left when someone tries to rewrite the sequence of truth. I traced it, lightly, feeling a memory stir, some lecture from years ago about palimpsests, where erased words leave behind ghosts of themselves. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, remarking that he could barely see the mark at all. That, I said, is precisely why it matters. The smudge was too intentional to be accidental, and too faint to be honest. The original name, whoever it belonged to, had been removed with a restraint that bordered on reverence. A thief who loved the object he was stealing. A liar who regretted the necessity of lying. When I asked Lewis to read the entries aloud, he did so with that soft, unobtrusive cadence that has always made him better company than I deserve. As he reached the erased line, he stumbled not in confusion, but as though something in his mind caught on a detail out of place. He said the spacing felt wrong. The entry above had been written at 1706 and the one below at 1728, yet the missing librarian had been logged entering at 1712. A 12-minute gap where no one else signed in, despite the faint trace of a second name. Two shadows, I murmured. One visible, one erased. Lewis asked whether I believed she had entered the vault with someone. I told him belief had very little to do with the matter. The ledger believed it for us. The question was not whether someone accompanied her, but who had taken such exquisite care to remove themselves from the record. I could feel the shape of a deduction forming, the way a crossword clue sometimes settles into place only after one stops consciously trying to solve it. We descended into the vault again, though neither of us expected answers. The air felt colder, carrying that quiet metallic scent of old climate controls and older stone. I walked toward the aisle where I had previously noticed the disturbed dust. It remained unsettled, as if someone had leaned there recently, perhaps even after our last visit. Lewis said the archivist swore no one had accessed the vault since morning. I told him the vault itself disagreed. A faint indentation marked the floor beside the shelf, nothing dramatic, just the slight compression left by someone shifting their weight during a moment of hesitation. It aligned perfectly with the smudged area on the ledger page. Someone who had been there was now trying, subtly and repeatedly, to erase their own presence. A futile effort, of course. People always leave traces, even when they believe themselves invisible. When we left the vault, I paused once more at the ledger. The erased name teased the edge of my memory, some clue I had seen earlier, filtered through the noise of the day. I couldn't grasp it fully, but I felt it circling, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Oxford has always been generous with shadows and stingy with illumination. As we stepped into the fading light of the corridor, Lewis asked what our next step should be. I told him, quietly, that we were no longer looking for a missing woman. We were looking for the person who had tried, with elegant restraint, to remain unwritten. And in Oxford, the unwritten are often the most dangerous. It was late afternoon when I returned to the librarian's office, though the room felt as if dawn had never fully arrived there. The windows were narrow, and the light seeped in cautiously, as though uncertain whether it was welcome. I sat at her desk with that quiet reluctance one feels when sifting through the belongings of someone who has not yet been declared lost, but is no longer present enough to defend their privacy. The air still held a faint trace of her lavender soap, old ink, something gentler than the world deserved. Lewis stood nearby, leafing through a stack of her research notes with that careful, almost reverent touch he reserves for things he fears may break. He said he had found nothing unusual. I told him nothing unusual was often where the truth hides. He didn't argue. The medieval diary she had been studying lay open in front of me, its pages brittle with age, its script wavering like a voice weakened by centuries. At first glance, the margins appeared to be nothing more than decorative flourishes, tiny loops, curls, and flickers of ink. But something about the pattern unsettled me. A rhythm that didn't match the scribe's style, a sequence that seemed too deliberate to be mere ornamentation. I traced a finger along the edge of the page and felt the faintest indentation beneath the ink. Pressure marks not from writing, but from repetition, as though someone had copied the pattern over and over before committing it to the page. A coded margin, hidden in plain sight. Lewis asked whether I saw something. I told him I wasn't sure yet, which was true, but uncertainty can be its own kind of clarity when one has spent enough of life navigating it. I reached for her notebook, the one she kept locked but had left open on the day she vanished. Her handwriting filled the pages in measured, careful strokes. Notes on medieval scriptoria, references to disputed genealogies, the occasional personal reflection slipped between academic lines like a sigh disguised as scholarship. Then I saw a series of tiny dots she had placed above certain letters in her transcription. Not random, not decorative. Patterned. Every dot rested above a letter corresponding to the marginal curves in the medieval diary. A key. Not a full translation, but the beginning of one. I leaned back, letting the discovery spread through me with a mixture of admiration and unease. She had been decoding something that someone else had wanted to keep buried, something old enough to be forgotten, but dangerous enough to haunt the present. Oxford has always excelled at such dualities. Lewis asked whether the code revealed anything specific. I told him it was too early to tell. The letter patterns formed a shape, but not yet a meaning, like a crossword clue whose answer one can almost taste but not name. A small deduction flickered when her reluctance to share her work, the misquoted Latin line, the photograph hidden beneath outdated forms. She had known she was close to something, and she had known someone else knew it too. The archivist entered quietly, perhaps too quietly, asking whether we needed anything else. His eyes flicked toward the open diary, then away again. A gesture so brief it might have been meaningless, but I have never believed in meaningless gestures. His hands were clasped too tightly, the knuckles pale. Fear rearranges the body before it reaches the voice. I asked him whether the diary had attracted interest recently. He said no, though the tremor in his phrasing betrayed him. Lewis glanced at me, registering it too. People rarely fear the discovery of innocence. After he left, I continued studying the margin, letting my thoughts drift between the inked symbols and the faint rain that had begun tapping against the window. The sound softened the room, made it feel strangely intimate, as though I were trespassing in her solitude. I copied the marked letters onto a sheet of paper. The sequence meant nothing to me yet, but the shape of it felt intentional, like a breath paused at the edge of a confession. And as I sat there, the evening deepening around us, I felt that the truth she had been pursuing, whatever ancient thread she had begun to unravel, was now winding itself around us too. Oxford keeps its oldest secrets in the margins, and she, with her quiet brilliance, had dared to read them aloud. Even now, when I think of that evening, I can still feel the air settling against my coat like a quiet reprimand. Oxford, after dusk, has a way of stripping people down to their truest selves, and as I walked across the quad toward the graduate researchers' rooms, I suspected I was about to meet a young man who had spent far too long practicing dishonesty in the mirror. Lewis walked beside me with that unobtrusive calm of his, saying little, though I could sense his thoughts drifting in the same direction mine were. We both knew the researcher admired the librarian. What remained uncertain was the shape that admiration had taken. He opened his door to us with the expression of someone who had rehearsed his greeting. The room was cramped, smelling faintly of damp books and instant coffee. Papers were stacked in tall, precarious columns. He said he hadn't slept, that he was worried, that he hardly knew her. Each claim floated into the air with a fragility that made me wonder whether he believed any of them himself. When I asked about his work with her, he looked at the floor a fraction of a second too long. A lover doesn't look away from a name that still hurts. He said she was brilliant, too brilliant perhaps, that she had been distant lately, distracted. I listened without interrupting, letting him reveal more in what he chose not to say. His hands trembled with the sort of nervousness that isn't born of guilt, but of longing pressed too hard against the ribs. Lewis asked whether he had seen her on the day she vanished. The pause that followed felt like a breath held underwater. He finally claimed he hadn't. The words fell flat. As he spoke, I noticed a book on his desk, an anthology of medieval poetry, its margins inked with notes written in her unmistakable hand. The kind of object one does not borrow casually. I touched the edge of the pages and felt the faint indentations of her pencil. He said she had lent it to him months ago, but the ink looked fresh, too fresh to belong to any distant exchange. A small deduction flickered. He'd kept something of hers close not for scholarship, but for solace. When we left him, Lewis exhaled softly and said the young man was lying. I told him lying was the least of his troubles. The real problem was that he didn't know how to lie well. Honest people, when they lie, reveal more than they conceal. His fear wasn't of the law, but of heartbreak. We walked back toward the Bodleian, the sky hanging low with the threat of rain. The cobblestones shone with that faint sheen they acquired just before the first drop fell. A few students hurried past, their laughter echoing briefly before dissolving into the night. I found myself thinking of the librarian not as a victim, not as a scholar, but as a woman who had stirred something in these men she worked beside. Admiration, envy, affection, all the quiet, dangerous ingredients of tragedy. Lewis asked what I made of the historian now. I told him the man's caution concerned me more than the graduate's clumsy anxiety. Caution is deliberate. Anxiety is accidental. And the historian's story had been far too polished to trust. The archivist, too, lingered uneasily in my mind, his shoulders folding inward whenever her name was spoken, his eyes flicking toward the vault corridor as though expecting it to answer for him. The rain began as a soft tapping against my sleeve, then steadied into something more resolute. We walked without speaking for a while, letting the city around us breathe its ancient melancholy into the spaces between our thoughts. The scent of wet stone rose from the pavement. Lamps flickered in upper windows, shadows moving behind drawn curtains like half-formed confessions. A crossword clue drifted into my mind, then not one I had encountered recently, but one I remembered from some long-forgotten puzzle. What remains unspoken, yet defines all that is spoken? The answer had been silence. It struck me, with a certain inevitability, that every person we had spoken to was constructing silence more deliberately than speech. When Lewis asked whether I believed the graduate capable of harming her, I told him harm need not take the form of violence. A heart already bruised can wound more deeply than a hand. But no, I didn't believe he had taken her. His sorrow was too raw to be theatrical. By the time we reached the end of the quad, the rain had become a steady curtain, blurring the world into a softer, more ambiguous place. I felt a strange sympathy for all of them, lovers, liars, scholars adrift in their own secrets. Oxford shapes people to internalize their failures quietly, and sometimes the quiet is what undoes them. As I walked home alone, the water gathering at my cuffs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were circling the truth but had not yet found its center. The margins of the diary, the erased name in the ledger, the photograph with its absent figure, each clue felt like a whisper waiting for someone patient enough to listen. And I, with the long night ahead, began listening in earnest. There are nights when the mind refuses the mercy of rest, and that night was one of them. I sat alone at my kitchen table long after the city had folded itself into darkness, the kettle cooling beside me, the encoded letters from the librarian's notebook spread out in a small constellation of paper fragments. Rain tapped against the window with a persistence that felt almost personal, as though urging me to move faster, to understand more quickly, to see what had been quietly waiting in plain sight. But comprehension has never bowed to impatience, least of all in Oxford. I copied the cipher again, letting the ink settle into the page with slow deliberation. The first sequence of her dots above specific letters had revealed a pattern, but not a meaning. Yet as I traced the shapes, I noticed something that had eluded me earlier. Beneath her handwriting, faint but undeniably present, lay another set of marks. Impressions, not ink. A second hand. A second cipher. Someone else had written on that page before she did, pressing hard enough to leave ghost lines, subtle grooves that caught the light when the paper was tilted, just so. I felt the familiar shift the moment deduction begins its quiet work. Someone had tried to guide her interpretation, not by leaving visible clues, but by shaping the page itself. A suggestion disguised as an accident, a whisper that hoped to become a conviction. Lewis arrived unannounced not long after midnight, gently knocking before stepping in. He said he couldn't sleep either. I slid the notebook toward him. He squinted at the faint indentations and said he wasn't sure whether they meant anything at all. I told him doubt is the birthplace of most truths. He smiled at that tired, resigned, and asked whether I believed the librarian had discovered the second cipher herself. I said she must have. She was too precise to miss it, and if she had seen it, she would have followed where it led, even into danger. We returned to the Bodleian together, an hour late enough that the streets felt entirely imagined, as though the city had become a memory rather than a place. A porter with a drawn face let us in without comment. The air inside was colder than usual, holding that peculiar stillness buildings acquire when they think no one is watching. I laid the notebook on a reading table beneath one of the weaker lamps. The shadows hesitated along the edges of the page. Using a soft pencil, I shaded lightly across the paper. The indentations revealed themselves with the slow grace of something waking from a long sleep. They formed not a message, but a directional architectural symbol common in old Oxford maps. A room, a chamber, a place no longer listed in modern plans. Lewis said he had never heard of such a room beneath the Radcliffe complex. I told him most people hadn't. Universities bury their own histories more often than any graveyard buries its dead. Someone had intended for her to find it, but only after deciphering the margins. Someone who knew the old architecture too intimately to be merely academic. We descended the staircase toward the lower vaults. The air grew colder, the stones sweating faintly under the glare of the emergency lights. I found the wall I'd been searching for, a pale, unremarkable stretch of stone interrupted only by a thin seam barely visible to the eye. A false wall, a hidden threshold, the kind masons once built for reasons now long forgotten. Lewis asked whether I was certain. Certainty, I said, is a luxury, but necessity makes its own truth. I pressed against the seam. Nothing happened. I tried again, slower this time, letting my fingers search for irregularity. A slight give beneath the left edge, softer than the surrounding stone. A mechanism disguised beneath centuries of dust. When I pushed, the wall shifted inward with a sound like a tired breath. Behind it, darkness stretched into an unlit corridor. We stepped inside, the narrow beam of Lewis's torch revealing old brickwork, the mortar thick with age. The passage sloped downward in a way that felt unsettlingly intentional. Then, just as the air grew colder still, the floor dipped an uneven patch of stone worn by long-forgotten traffic. At the end of the corridor, the torchlight caught the outline of a wooden door, its surface warped, its hinges rusted but intact. Someone had been there recently. The dust in front of it had been disturbed. A single footprint, faint but present, led toward it, and another smaller, more hesitant away. I felt a tightening in my chest then, not of fear, but of recognition. She had been here, and someone else. The erased shadow in the ledger, the careful misquotation, the hidden photograph. Every fragment converged toward this narrow, silent place where the past had never truly slept. Lewis asked whether we should enter. The rain above us grew louder, its distant rhythm echoing through the stone like a heartbeat. I told him we already had. Even now, when memory has softened the sharper edges of that night, I can still feel the weight of the air as we stepped through the narrow doorway. It was a cold that didn't belong to weather older, denser, carrying the stillness of places the living seldom enter. Lewis raised the torch, its beam trembling slightly in his hand, though he'd never admit to nervousness. The light fell on a small stone chamber, its ceiling low, its walls slick with the faint sheen of moisture. A room forgotten by architects and custodians alike, a room that had been waiting. She lay near the far wall, half slumped against the collapsed stones that had caved inward from some ancient structural weakness. Her clothes were coated in dust, her hair tangled in brittle strands, but her eyes opened when she heard us. I remember the soft exhale, relief, exhaustion, disbelief, all woven into one fragile sound. Lewis went to her immediately, calling her name with a gentleness that surprised even him. She tried to answer, but her voice cracked like paper left too long in sunlight. I stayed back for a moment, letting the reality settle. The missing librarian, alive but caught between ruin and rescue. The small chamber where she had waited and nearly vanished from every record except the ones someone had tried so carefully to rewrite. It was not triumph I felt then, but a muted ache, the knowledge that her survival had less to do with our deduction and more to do with her own stubborn will. When I knelt beside her, she gripped my sleeve with the weak insistence of someone fighting sleep. She said she hadn't meant to fall. She had followed him here, the historian, and the stones had given way beneath them during their argument. He had left her behind, she whispered, not because he wished her dead, but because he feared what her discovery would do to the life he had built from a lie. Her words drifted, fading in and out like a flickering radio signal. Yet each fragment held the weary truth of someone who had been speaking only to the silence for far too long. Lewis asked whether she was injured. She said she wasn't sure. Pain, she murmured, had become indistinct, more a companion than a sensation. He told her help was on its way, though we both knew that in a room like this, reassurance felt more symbolic than factual. The passage behind us seemed to hold its breath, the darkness listening as it always had. I searched the chamber while Lewis stayed with her. There were faint marks on the floor scuffs, indentations, traces of movement made before the collapse. The historian had stood here with her. The way the dust had shifted suggested he had paced, perhaps hesitated, perhaps lost the courage to do what he initially intended. A man torn between ambition and conscience. It is a dangerous place to stand. Against one wall rested a fragment of wood, the splintered remains of a support beam. On it, I noticed a small smear of ink. Black, fresh enough to resist the years. I scraped it gently with my thumb, feeling a dull resistance. He had touched this after handling some manuscript or note, likely the misquoted Latin slip he'd left for her. A signature hidden in an accident, a stain that, like his guilt, had followed him into secrecy. Lewis asked whether I thought the historian would flee. I told him flight was a younger man's instinct. The historian would rationalize, negotiate with his conscience, seek refuge in academic rhetoric. He would convince himself he had no choice. People like him rarely run, they remain and rewrite. The librarian tugged weakly at my sleeve again. She said she had left us a trail. A second cipher, not the one in the medieval diary, but one she had created in her notes, the faint indentations I had discovered. A map, a plea disguised as scholarship. She apologized for not making it clearer. I told her she had made it clear enough. She closed her eyes then, but the tension left her body with a kind of trust I hadn't expected. We heard the distant echo of approaching voices, medics and security staff, and the chamber seemed to expand with the prospect of rescue. Lewis squeezed her hand and told her she was safe. Safety, I knew, was a relative state, but she nodded, accepting it as a temporary truth. As they carried her out of the chamber, I lingered behind, letting the silence reclaim its domain. The walls felt older than anything we had touched in the case, and older still than the lies woven into its fabric. I ran my hand along one of the stones, feeling the cold grit beneath my fingers. So much history, so much forgetting. Oxford's greatest talent has always been its ability to bury what it no longer wishes to remember. When I finally turned to leave, the torchlight caught the corner of something half hidden beneath the collapsed stone, a small scrap of parchment torn from the medieval diary. I picked it up, brushing away the dust. A single Latin phrase, correctly quoted this time, glimmered faintly in fading ink. The truth is a lamp for the seeking, not worthy. As I stepped back into the passage, the distant rain pressed its rhythm into the earth above, a steady pulse that felt painfully human. And for the first time since she vanished, I felt the case settling not into certainty, but into the deeper, quieter understanding that all tragedies begin with something unbearably ordinary. A choice, a fear, a silence.